Good afternoon, and welcome to the first of a series of webinars on advancing police practices through reform, sponsored by the National Law Enforcement Knowledge Lab. My name is Arif Alikhan, and I'm the lead subject matter expert for constitutional policing for the Knowledge Lab. I'm also the former director of constitutional policing for the Los Angeles Police Department, and it is my distinct privilege to be your host for today's panel discussion with three outstanding senior police leaders to discuss the experiences of both the LAPD and Seattle Police Departments in both the many challenges and changes enabled by the federal consent decree. As you may know, the LAPD was one of the first municipal agencies to come under a pattern and practice investigation by the U.S. Department of Justice, resulting in a federal consent decree in 2001. The wide-ranging requirements included a series of reforms regarding gang units, confidential informants, uses of force in their review, responses to mental health crises, training, civilian oversight, community relations, and several other areas. 8 years later, after a change of leadership in the department, the city was found in substantial compliance and entered into a transition agreement on two provisions that were implemented within the next 2 years when the decree was fully terminated in 2011. The city of Seattle and its police department entered into a federal consent decree in 2012, focused on several areas, including uses of force, crisis response, and various policies and procedures in place at the time. In September of last year, a federal judge found that Seattle Police Department was in consistent compliance with the core requirements of the decree and had reduced serious uses of force by 60%, performed significantly better in response to behavioral health crises, and significantly improved their policies and the legal requirements for policing in almost all instances assessed. While there are a few areas that SPD continues to work on that our guests will discuss in a few minutes, they instituted significant and sometimes difficult changes in their organization over the many years under federal supervision and scrutiny. Joining us from the Seattle Police Department as part of this panel are two people in the department who were there from the beginning and have been instrumental in the implementation of those reforms. The first panelist is Rebecca Boatwright. She is the General Counsel and Executive Director of Analytics and Research at the Seattle Police Department, where she oversees the units responsible for audits, risk management, litigation support, performance analytics, and data-driven policing. Thank you for joining us, Rebecca. Brian Maxey is the Chief Operating Officer of the Seattle Police Department, overseeing professional standards, budget and finance, administrative services, information technology, and intergovernmental relations. He previously served on federal monitoring teams in Cleveland and Baltimore and worked as a police practices consultant. Sandy Jo MacArthur is a 35-year police veteran and former Assistant Chief of Police, responsible for successfully implementing major consent decree requirements at the LAPD. She currently leads the University of Chicago Crime Lab's Police Leadership Academy as the Director of Curriculum Design and as a consultant to various agencies on police training, crisis response programs, and officer wellness. I want to thank all three of you for joining us today. And I want to note that we very much welcome your questions from the audience. If you could please submit those in the chat or the question box, we'll be screening them, and I will do my best to try to incorporate them into the discussion, which is intended to be very fluid. We can go into various areas, and just looking for the insights and the expertise of our distinguished panelists on how their experiences in consent decrees can not only help those agencies that are in negotiations or in under federal supervision or state supervision, but also the things that could just simply help police performance, police, and the critical mission of protecting communities from harm and pursuing justice on behalf of victims. So, Chief MacArthur, I'd like to start with you. Could you go back to 2001? I know it was quite some time ago, but what was it like at the LAPD when the Department of Justice launched its investigation of the LAPD? What was sort of the feeling and the reaction by the leadership and also internally within the department?
So I think leadership and rank and file alike thought we were the great grand experiment. It hadn't been done before. No one even understood what it was. We couldn't get a lot of information. There wasn't a lot of back and forth. So we had limited information in the rank and file, and we were very frustrated because we didn't understand. We found problems within our organization. We thought we were fixing them. So we really didn't understand what pattern and practice really meant. The leadership was very defensive. which did not make the rank and file comfortable. So the leadership felt, hey, we figured we find these problems ourselves through our own audits and inspections, whether that's accurate or not. That's how the leadership felt during when we first got hit with this. And then what sort of progressed, which made it very difficult, was the leadership took a stance. We do not want this to happen. So that put our whole department sort of in a tailspin. Also, we then started having a little bit of conflict with the political arena in Los Angeles, because they're like, come on in, if you're going to do this, bring it in. And so we were in a bit of a disarray for a bit. There wasn't, we weren't embracing what it was going to do. We had no idea what we were about to embark on. And so there was a lot of very frustrated people at all ranks, but our leadership at the top did not want to participate, did not
And if
want
I
to
can just
cooperate.
add, well, thank you for that, Sandy Jo. Just to add a little bit more context, and I didn't mention this at the beginning, is sort of the genesis, the sort of the situation that prompted the DOJ investigation was, of course, a corruption scandal in the Rampart division of LAPD among the gang unit in dealing with suspects, and also other officers who were committing crimes, essentially on duty. And you mentioned that they had felt that they had looked into that
Yes.
Rampart report that had been produced by a Blue Ribbon panel.
Yes, there was so.
And did that help with any? I'm sorry. Go ahead. I was just going to ask that helping in sort of getting you started with the things that you might have anticipated were going to happen if you entered into a consent decree.
So yes, there was what everybody across the country knows as the Rampart scandal, and we uncovered problems with narcotics that was being taken by our gang officers. We uncovered some really horrific behavior that was happening in at least one of our gang units, and then we uncovered a lot of problematic, not very well managed gang units throughout the city. So that was the Blue Ribbon panel was brought about, and they created this report. And it wasn't just about the Rampart incident, which is what our department uncovered. It was also, we had a couple of other officers that had been arrested for corruption, for poor treatment. And so, but you see, at the time, because we didn't understand pattern and practice, it was a very new concept. We were operating as an organization, as I think were a lot of organizations. You uncover a problem, it goes to internal affairs, you fix the problem, you deal with it, and then you move on. And in this case, what the Blue Ribbon panel laid out was all of these different pieces, which in their opinion resulted in very difficult checks and balances, or poor checks and balances, not strong leadership in a lot of these agencies. So there was a lot of not just specifics from the Blue Ribbon panel about the specific incidents they looked into, but they were also pretty much attacking our leadership or the lack of checks and balances. So we sort of had an idea of what they were going to be going after, but at the same time, we didn't know the detail that was going to happen.
And I know a lot of it that was required ultimately was the accountability and the leadership development is necessary. And I'll get back to you to talk about that. But before we do that, I'd like to jump over to Brian Maxey, who was there at the beginning with Seattle Police Department. Brian, can you just remind everybody, what was the genesis for the pattern practice investigation and ultimately the consent decree that was entered into?
Well, Seattle had several high-profile events ranging from about 2008 to 2010 that really caused consternation in our community. And then there were many community groups and nonprofits that came together and wrote a letter to the Department of Justice requesting intervention in the investigation. The most high profile of those incidents was the shooting of a Native American woodcarver, John T. Williams, by one of our officers. He was deaf, or at least very hard of hearing, and did not immediately respond to commands. He had a knife in his hand that he used for carving wood, and there was a piece of wood that he was working on, and he did not immediately respond. This led to a shooting of and killing of John T. Williams. That really, I think, was the tipping point that led to the investigation. I don't think anyone in Seattle was surprised when the investigation started, and the initial instructions at that time. I was in the city attorney's office working as counsel on the consent decree, well, we didn't have that yet, but on the investigation. And the initial approach when DOJ came to town was to provide them everything. We opened up our precincts. We provided hundreds of thousands of pages of documentation. Terabytes of what we had then was in-car video. Everything we had, we provided, and in fact, that initial engagement was heralded as the fastest discovery process the Department of Justice had ever seen, and that took some time for them to parse through everything that we gave them.
Great, and Brian, and then I'll ask Rebecca this as well. In those negotiations, when you look back at what was ultimately agreed upon, were there particular provisions that you wish had been added or negotiated in the consent decree that would have been helpful for the implementation or to avoid some of the potential challenges or conflicts?
Let me answer that by saying that when we first got the consent decree, we were a city divided. We had the executive and the police department that were very surprised. We had originally thought we were headed towards some form of collaborative agreement similar to what Austin or Las Vegas had entered into. And we were very surprised to know that we were declared to be the most violent police department in the United States, with 20% of our force being excessive. And for us, it was off the charts. And I think that led to a strong reaction by the executive that in many ways impacted the negotiations, because even though city council and the city attorney's office was definitely pulling towards the consent decree, the executive and SPD were pulling away from it, which just, I think, made the negotiations harder than they needed to be. And I know Becca has very strong opinions on what should have been in there that was not, so I'll defer to her on that next piece.
Rebecca, if you could answer that question, but also you were in the department at the time, and you were looking at departments view, but how did you deal with that dynamic? Cities are rare, there's a lot of dynamics, political and otherwise. How did you sort of deal with from the department perspective?
So I was actually also at the city attorney's office at the time. I was on the same team that Brian was, although he was more definitely more in the weeds on the discovery than I was. Let me answer the first question first. And sure. You know, this is not a criticism of our consent decree, because it's you know, it's certainly been an evolving process, but officer wellness is a key component that is missing from our consent decree, and that put us behind the ball quite a bit. And you know, speaking from the perspective of I wish I knew then what I know now. I want to give tremendous kudos to Louisville, who I think is doing this absolutely correctly. The first thing that they did, of course, was roll out a phenomenal officer wellness system. Consent decrees at the end of the day should not land as an indictment of the officers who are out there on the streets doing the work. They're an indictment of cities for failing to keep a core operating department staff trained, equipped to meet the emerging challenges and the evolving challenges in the public safety space. And to do that requires careful change management, and we missed the boat on that in Seattle. The White House's 2016 21st Century Policing Report, of course, called out officer wellness as a central pillar of police reform on par with the other pillars. I think that was absolutely right. We are playing catch up to other departments in terms of how we are reaching the the needs of our officers, the physical, the psychological, the emotional needs of our officers. And I wish we had had that as a component of the consent decree. In terms of dealing with the other stakeholders, Seattle is a unique case study in that our city attorney, campaigned on the platform of he was going to bring the Department of Justice to town to take a look at SPD. That's a unique posture to be in, where the chief litigation officer for the city is also working towards the same end as the Department of Justice. It was helpful in that it set the tone of the law department, certainly towards facilitating the expedited discovery that Brian mentioned. But it did put him at odds with the executive and the chief of police, who are arguably the clients that he is tasked to represent in this process. You know, I think the thing that all departments struggle with is departments get very in the weeds in terms of the investigation and what the consent decree means and what the different terms in the consent decree mean. And departments are guided by lawyers who do look at consent decrees as, you know, a legally binding agreement that's to be construed within the four corners of the agreement. And messaging that to community, messaging that to elected officials, and to the media in particular, who are not able to get into the weeds or the nuances of what ultimately is a fairly boring document. It has been, I think, our biggest challenge. I think the consent decree, as it's understood by our city stakeholders and our community stakeholders, our stakeholders in the media and the court, are not as we as a department and as the lawyers for the department would read it to be.
You know, and that brings up a good point about just understanding what a consent decree is and the challenge of that even internally, getting officers to understand what it is. Sandy Jo, you were in a unique position because you have to go by in terms of what a consent decree was. How did the department address that once there was a consent decree entered into with the Department of Justice and adopted by the court?
So as you're well aware, we had a transition of leadership from the first chief to the second one. And with our first chief, we were really struggling because our leadership within the department, we were working with our city attorney, which was good. However, there was a lot of ambiguity in our consent decree. And so there was a lot of beliefs on, we had the Department of Justice, we had the monitor, and then we had the police department in the city. And all four of us couldn't agree on what the consent decree really was asking for or was demanding or was requiring. So some was very easy and it made it like, okay, we can do this. But a lot of it was not. A lot of it, even after everything was said and done, we had to do some negotiations, and the negotiations wasn't very effective until we got new leadership. And once we got new leadership who was no longer pushing back on the consent decree, who was actually embracing the consent decree, we were able to actually start to do more of a negotiation mindset. So we could better understand what those, to Rebecca's point, what are within the four corners of the consent decree. So many times the community, because they had access to the consent decree, they would interpret these vague paragraphs and believe they knew what the consent decree meant, when in fact that wasn't what the monitor or the DOJ was saying. But we also had a lot of creep, if you will, where the monitor or the Department of Justice would say, well, we meant X, Y, or Z. And yet there was nothing documented for that. So Chief Bratton came in, he was the transition, he transitioned us from the one chief to the next, and he had been actually on the monitoring team, which is a very interesting dynamic. We all panicked. Oh my gosh, we're in trouble now. And in reality, it was a very good thing. And he did something that was unique because, as Rebecca stated before, all these attorneys negotiated our consent decree. He brought one of the negotiators from the consent decree onto the LAPD as a civilian, which you ultimately took the role of later on in life, Arif. But that helped us really try to, when we were negotiating, we actually had a little bit of power there where we could say, hey, that wasn't what was negotiated. Because what we found was we were fighting so much about what did this paragraph mean, what was required of it. And we were getting very bogged down and frustrated, and we weren't able to move things forward. I just want to enunciate, because I still don't see consent decrees doing this as well as they could be doing today. But officer wellness wasn't part of ours at all. And so we really learned very, very quickly that, quite honestly, because if it wasn't written in the consent decree, the monitor wasn't too terribly concerned about it in the beginning. Over time, there was a better synthesizing of officer wellness, and that's going to be important to the consent decree. But what was frustrating to me, because when Chief Bratton came in, I was a lieutenant, so I still considered rank and file. We still had no clear message. So we were just like creating what we thought would get us into compliance, and then they'd come in and they'd audit and say, nope, not in compliance. So it was like there was a us versus them mentality still. When Bill Bratton came in as the chief, he sort of had everybody roll their sleeves up, and we started to finally move forward on some of these things. But even until the very end, as you well know, even during or to get to the transition period, there were still arguments about body worn cameras supposed to be part of the consent decree. Well, they didn't even exist in the beginning, but they were trying to be brought in. So that just, I don't know if I totally answered your question, but
no,
go ahead.
I mean, I think what you mentioned is there was so much complexity to this because there wasn't a lot known. You had mixed messages coming from the leadership, and it wasn't until Chief Bratton came in that you started kind of coalescing around this is what we have to deal with. And I always like to characterize, I was in the mayor's office, as you know, at the time, that he saw the consent decree as less of a barrier and more of a benefit to institute the changes that he wanted. And as a point that I often make is that many of the things that a consent decree requires are usually the things that political leadership say the department needs, but will never fund it with the resources. In fact, they're going to cut the training, they're going to cut the technology and all the things that the consent decrees require. I just want to mention one other thing too is just taking kind of paraphrasing what you're saying is that we often think of the negotiations as coming up with the consent decree. But I think what Becca and what you're saying is negotiations are ongoing, especially because the consent decrees, the LAPD was 187 paragraphs. And sometimes people think the solution is a more extensive one. So Chicago, for example, has over 800 paragraphs, but there's still always going to be some give and take, some negotiation to come a meeting of the minds that go on throughout all the way until the very end. And I think that's an important thing for people to realize. Let's move into implementation. And now you have it, and now you have mandates. We talked a little bit about that sort of back and forth with not only at this point with DOJ, but also the monitor. But how did you approach the need to make pretty significant changes? And as we all know, policing is very resistant to change at times. How did you deal with that, Brian? I assume at some point when you came over to the department at some point, correct? And when was that, and how much were you involved in the actual implementation at that point?
So I came over to the police department in 2014. I was actually presenting on the consent decree when we too had a change in leadership, and Kathleen O'Toole came in as our chief. And when she watched me present, we had a brief meeting after, and she wanted to bring me in-house as general counsel, and then a year later put me into the chief operating officer role. So that really had two stages to my involvement directly at SPD. The first was guiding and managing the consent decree from a far more legal perspective, and then moved into a far more practical implementation role where all of the necessary elements that you're going to need to move through this. And in the past question you asked, what is a consent decree? And yeah, there's a document with four corners, but ultimately, I think the whole point of consent decrees is to create a genuine learning organization. I think at its core, that's the most important thing, which police departments are somewhat structured to do. For example, a SWAT team after a critical incident or engagement will go back, debrief, look at tactical approaches and how can they do better next time. They do have that reflective process built in, but at the patrol level, historically where we were in the early 2010s was, patrol would go out, they'd do their work, they'd write it down, it was probably reviewed by a supervisor, and then the organization never really looked at that again. We didn't look at the use of force, we didn't look at the stops, we didn't look at any patterns, we had no curiosity, and ultimately we had very, very, very little data at that point in time. So the push on implementation was first, what systems do we need? And that meant adding people into policy, adding people into training, adding people into technology, bringing in analysts. But also, as we created the Professional Standards Bureau to manage this it was critically important to have leadership at a level, and we put it at the assistant chief level, but ultimately the chief operating officer level as well, because there will be resistance, there will be different aspects of the department that are not going to go along with this or not do so easily. And you need that high level of command. Initially, we tried to have it at a coordinator level to organize the department, but they didn't have the fundamental authority to drive the change that we needed. And once you have the capacity, once you've got true diversity of thought, as you're thinking about what does this mean, how do we get to where we need to go, the sophistication level rises. And that's when things start to get very, very interesting in this process. That's where the conversations with the monitor and the Department of Justice switch from being adversarial or task driven, or this is what you need to do, to, hey, here's what we're thinking. What do you think? Have you seen this before? Other police departments come in, there's more cross-pollination. And again, this learning starts to happen. And once the learning happens, then it can actually be absorbed.
So you mentioned about the learning about how other departments do things, but give us kind of a practical example of what wasn't existing in Seattle PD that helped it become a learning organization, as you mentioned. That's an principle that every organization should consider as something that's done, because learning means you're improving, you're creating better tactics for officers to prevent themselves from getting hurt, or just that type of thing. So could you, I just want to pull on that thread a little bit with you.
Yeah, so when I talk about the learning organization piece, we didn't have the data when the Department of Justice came to town to really show our work and defend it. We had case by case examples, and we could slog through it, and we did to some degree with them, but we didn't have this aggregated. We did not have the data analytic structure to know, look for emerging trends, to hold ourselves accountable, because we simply didn't have the awareness that we needed to have. So first you build the capacity, you change how officers are documenting their work, you get it into an electronic system, you get away from paper, you integrate your CAD and your RMS, you start pulling in and use of force and aggregating this data. And we have a huge investment that Becca can actually speak very well to as she leads this efforts today, but we invested $30 million in a data analytics platform in order to aggregate all this information so we could look at it holistically. And part of that was also, turning that out transparently, showing our work publicly. We put out the data sets, we have the dashboards. All of that allows for external accountability, which again feeds that learning and that data curiosity that we now have within this department. It takes leadership to believe in that, though, because it's much easier to keep your head in the sand and not look at all of the activities. And then once you're aware, you need to have the appropriate structures to how are you going to analyze this? And then, if there is accountability that's needed, how do you deal with that? And something that we did very poorly is when there's success, how do you show that? And that
let's hold to that about the success and how you get that out, especially to the community. I just want to transfer over to Becca, kind of on this topic of both. I mean, you're responsible for the data analytics. I think Seattle has emerged undoubtedly as the leader on this, but also you're responsible for auditing and compliance and those types of things. How have you used the data analytics and also the other accountability features you have to help become more of a learning organization?
So I want to highlight the incredible workforce that we have in our data analytics section. We have the benefit of now 4 PhDs in technical fields, and the director is in the process of completing his dissertation. Primarily, we shifted from here's our data, here are the numbers, infer for yourself what it means, to providing more descriptive analytics and really pivoting the question not to here's our data, but what is the question that you want answered, and how can we use analytics to show what that answer is, and be very transparent about how it is that we're analyzing this. We, as part of our mantra, we put as much out publicly as we can. We are big on transparency, and we are also big on peer review. So there's very little that we put out in terms of analytics that is not peer reviewed by academics, around the country. Our goal is to crowdsource our analytics to an extent too. Here's our data publicly. Here's what we think it means, but beat us at our own game. Tell us what we're missing. Tell us another way to analyze what the data are showing. I think one of the challenges, though, that you face with analytics is that as you get more sophisticated with how you're looking at your data, how you're presenting your data, the more complex it is to tell that story publicly. And I'll give you an example of that. Every consent decree that I'm aware of contains bias-free policing elements and looks at how are you measuring disparity. The traditional approach to measuring disparity is to look at, the application of social service X over population demographics and to balance it in that respect. We know that's not the case. We inherit at policing, you inherit all of the disparities that are upstream of policing and in early childhood education, housing, healthcare, et cetera. Being honest about what we can control from a management perspective in terms of assuring the equity of outcome of police interaction is where we're trying to drive the conversation, because that's something we can actually manage. So we've employed techniques such as propensity score weighting to look at all other things being equal to the extent that we can hold them equal. Is there a difference? Is there a disparity in the outcome of a police contact? Looking at risk managed demand. How are we allocating our resources to ensure that we're not over policing or under policing any particular area relative to the demand for police services in that area. But it becomes a very complicated story to tell, especially when you are speaking to the media, which contains word limits in their articles or time segments on in newscasts. And certainly to community who is used to looking at disparity as disproportionality. I hope that answered the question to an extent.
Yes, no, that was great. I think you make a really good point, very well stated about how policing, the disparities are upstream and policing inherits that. And rather than simply rejecting it as a basis of looking at it, it sounds like you guys did a very good job of figuring out, okay, what else can we look at in terms of the outcome and the analytics there. I want to ask a follow-up question, Becca. One of the questions we're getting from an attendee is, are there ways to get these lessons learned to smaller police departments where the cost and expertise required is very daunting? And I guess a follow-on, even with departments that may have the resources, what would you think are the main selling points to try to convince the appropriators, the budget folks, about why this is a benefit in many different ways for the whole city? So if kind of a two-part question, but if you could take that on, that would be great.
Sure. For smaller departments, I would say lean into the expertise of other departments around the country. We certainly do. And we're certainly, on the national circuit in terms of engaging with anyone who wants to chat with us. There's a lot of information out there. The Knowledge Lab is an important, endeavor in that respect and coordinating information. Department of Justice certainly has subject matter experts who are available to provide, technical expertise. And there's a lot of people around the country who are here to support any department, but certainly smaller departments as they embark on these endeavors. So reach out, lean in. Your second question is a very good one, and it's something that we struggle with in terms of sustainment. As Brian mentioned, part of our problem was we did not have the systems in place to collect and to analyze our data and to tell our own story. In Seattle, technology services are integrated into a separate department. That is a resource, an in-house resource that we lost. We're competing with other city departments for attention from the Department of Information Technology. And to some extent, we're bound by city protocols in terms of how it is that we look into technology advancements. And technology, I think it doubles in capacity every 18 months or something like that. The advancements in technology are enormous. The 30 million that we invested into a data analytics platform, they're now off the shelf software solutions that can do much of that that work for you. But all of this needs to be maintained. And in convincing your elected leaders that what got us into a consent decree was a failure to continue the research and development components of the department. And departments are at risk of falling back once a city becomes complacent in terms of, assuming you reached a certain threshold, but failing to maintain it at that level of advancement.
No, that's a great point. We'll get back to that about the transition and especially the community concerns of some sort of regression, slippage back into the conditions that result in the decree, both and with LAPD. Sandy Jo, I'd like to get back to something about the implementation of consent decree. A big piece of that, of course, is training, something that you were vital in changing, especially in an agency that was at that time around 9,000 officers. How did you tackle that challenge in terms of resources, in terms of even logistics, on having to do training with so many personnel, develop new curriculum, et cetera?
So we were very fortunate because early in late 1990s, we ended up hiring, the department did, a director of police training and education, a PhD non-sworn, who had experience within the department from the wellness perspective, right? So and their background was in education. So we actually had somebody on ground that was their full-time job was to work on the training component with us. And so there was, back then even, there was this thought process, we need to do integrated training. We cannot do standalone stovepipe types training where we talk about X, paragraph XY, and we leave A and B off, right? So we were fortunate, and it took us a lot of beating our head against the wall to get our management and leadership to understand that this was critical. And really, quite honestly, when Bratton came in, boom, the top came off of that, because he believed, to Brian's point, in creating learning organizations, right? We were doing a lot of training, but we were doing stovepipe training in LAPD. And our director of police training and education, she's like, we got to do integrated training. We cannot do consent decree training. It'll turn into hate training, right? If you just do consent decree training. So for our perspective, really very important for us at that point to really dig deep with the monitor. The monitor was key for us in the beginning. What is it that you see in our training that is working and what is not working? And that's kind of a hard thing to do. Today it's better, but organizations always were insular, especially larger ones, were like, oh, we know the best, right, type of thing. And LAPD was no different than any other large agency in the 90s. We thought we knew what we were doing. And so working with the monitors and then starting to realize we had to go outside to other agencies. What are you doing? And that is how we built the mindset of creating that learning organization. And it is also how we started to create opportunities within our use of force, within our de-escalation, within our legal update, how we could integrate consent decree components into it. So we flipped it from doing consent decree training to doing training for police that's going to make us do our job, or allow us to do our job safer and legally and constitutionally correct, right? And so for us, that flip, it sounds so simple. It isn't an easy flip to do, because it's easy for agencies to go, I'll just check the box off and we'll do A, B, C, for get consent decree out of the way, and then I can do the real training. And by flipping that consent decree, in everything we taught, there was a component of consent decree training. It took a lot of work for us to realize where we could integrate it, and also a collaborative approach with our monitors, who would say, hey, have you thought about adding X to this? Would it make sense, right? And so that's how I think we flipped it. And what I like, what we did, which was not LAPD historically, is we now are very, to Rebecca's point, we reached out to a lot of other agencies and we started to see what are they doing. And it became this sort of synergy thing where now we have these relationships. And to Rebecca's point, lean in. If you're brand new to this game, lean into agencies like Seattle, like LA. We are willing to share. I always say we first share our mistakes and then we share our successes. And I think that there's just so much that agencies can do now in terms of like looking at things and how do we improve by looking at other agencies. And some are still afraid to reach out to us because big agencies had this attitude. Big
Right.
agencies are quite different today. And I mean, when I've gone up and worked with Seattle on some crowd management stuff in the aftermath of what happened in 2020, I actually great feedback from them, and vice versa. They were working with LA and in Chicago, and it's just
Sure.
very important that you do not look at consent decrees as consent decree training.
Right. And framing it is so important. If I could add two things that I think also influence, largely driven by you, is that LAPD really changes training, from what I understand, to promote adult learning concepts as opposed to just the PowerPoint, here's the training, do this, do that. And then also as part of that, creating a what ended up being approved by the state of California, the Post Commission advanced instructor course, actually training the trainers about how to teach and how to train, which is used. And I know many departments have modeled their courses after that because those are such important elements of that training. Brian or Becca, do you have any thoughts on the training experiences for Seattle? Brian, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, everything I just heard really resounded with me because we went through the same arc of our training. When you set out to train to a consent decree, you look at the different paragraphs and you go, okay, now we're going to do use of force training. Now we're going to do a stops training. Now we're going to do crisis training. And you go one by one, except that's not the way police work. That's not the way it manifests. You're a police officer, you are dispatched, you go to a call and you deal with whatever you have. If you know this is a crisis call, you put on your crisis hat and you go, okay, I'm going to use de-escalation and I'm going to use communication, and you're all primed for that. Well, we wanted our officers to do that for any call. It's the same mindset. It doesn't matter what you end up with, as long as the approach is consistent and you're using all the values that really are behind the consent decree and some of the motivations for it, you're far better off. Also, we struggled for a long time to get our trainers to not say, hey guys, we got to teach this to you because the consent decree says we have to, or this is the DOJ portion here, or these subtle digs that really undermined the value. And as Chief MacArthur said moments ago, the whole point is to actually train our officers to do better policing. Like, there is value. There's this. Every metric we have shows that the training that we did and the policies we implemented had better outcomes for our officers as well as for our community. And those two things means that it's better for our reputation, our legitimacy, and has so many downstream benefits. But if you're still glaring at the document and saying we shouldn't be forced to do this and rejecting it all, you've got a problem, and you've got to get beyond that and realize that modern policing is complicated. It communities are demanding more and more of us, and they continue to evolve in their expectations. So you need to be agile as a department, and agility is just something that does not come naturally to police departments. In fact, they're often constituted to avoid change, not to embrace it.
Right. Well, thank you. Rebecca, I want to shift on, unless you had something else on the training side, I wanted to ask you about something that we've talked about before that is often missed when the discussion of a consent decree comes into play, which is the role of the federal district judge, and the power that a judge and the influence that a judge has in actually how the entire environment, implementation, et cetera, comes. You have had a very active judge in your consent decree. And I'm not asking you to evaluate his performance or anything, but could you just talk about how that affects the dynamics of a consent decree as a whole?
Sure. I think one thing that is, to your point, the judges vary across the board in terms of how they approach their role on the consent decree. For anyone who is at the consent decree conference in Fort Worth last fall, I believe it was, there was a panel of judges speaking about the role of the judge. And it was interesting in that you had Judge Bedard out of Baltimore who said, look, my job, this is an agreement between the parties. It's a court order. My job is to ensure that it is implemented according to its terms, no more, no less. Our judge has taken a very different approach. I think in one of our first pre-hearing conferences, he said, the consent decree, the parties may view this as a contract between themselves. Let me be clear, it is not. It is a court order that I will modify as I see fit. And, I'm not going to get into, which is the correct interpretation under the law, but it is challenging for a department to then, the narrative shifts from what do we need to do in order to ensure that we are meeting the terms and expectations of the consent decree to what do we need to do to make sure the judge is satisfied at the next hearing. An example of that is accountability. Accountability has very few requirements. There are very few requirements in our consent decree relating to accountability. We satisfied the only actionable requirement back in 2014, which is to create a manual articulating the practices that the DOJ had held out as sufficient. And yet we remain out of full and effective compliance as a city because there are conditions of an ordinance enacted in 2017 that have not yet been bargained and are therefore not in effect. And it's the Department of Justice has essentially said, look, we don't get involved in matters of city legislation. This is between essentially the city and the court. But it's a challenge for us as a department. And when that narrative shifts from let's not get yelled at by the judge to, instead of how do we make sure that we are meeting and sustaining all of the requirements that we are bound to by the document.
Great, thank you. That's, I think people often don't understand the dynamics of federal court and federal judges. Having been a prosecutor for 10 years in federal court, I was often more concerned about who the judge was than the verdict coming back from the jury, because it has pretty profound influence, and understanding who it is, how that works is critical. I'd like to transition over to the transition. And you're now at that point where you are close to substantial compliance or consistent compliance, and now you're typically transitioning to maybe a couple of things, which is what we did at LAPD. And what are some of the challenges you get from people maybe, or dynamics that you didn't expect when you get close to that opportunity to either get a consent decree terminated or just transition to something that's much less onerous? Sandy Jo, do you want to start off with that?
Sure. I called it sustainability. How are we going to prove to the judge? Basically, we had a judge similar to Seattle, very, very involved. And when everybody, the monitor, the DOJ, and us all went to court to get out of the consent decree, the judge was saying, no, no, no. And it really started to focus on a couple of things, moving the goalpost a little bit, but also sustainability. He really did not believe we were going to sustain the changes. So what we had been working on our entire time in the consent decree before we went to the transitional component was, how can we prove we've done what we need to do, and how can we prove it is good and effective and quality. And now all of a sudden we're hit with how do we know you're going to sustain these changes? So it was sort of a like aha moment for us, because we just made the assumption, okay, we've got audit division, we've got professional standards bureau, and we've got force investigations division, and all of these types of things. But what we found is we didn't really have it documented in an area that was looking through the lens of sustainability. Mm-hmm. So we had to start to put together plans on how, for example, our audit division would start to take over the role of the monitor, for example, and the auditing the monitor did. So what we actually had to create was a new sort of document that said the monitor was going to start auditing LAPD's audit division audits. And so it gave us a perspective of documentation in pretty significant detail, but not just in audits. Our audit division was really good at it, but starting to look at what were the different entities, like the command that oversaw the gang units. Do they have the documentation done? Are they doing inspections prior to audits and things like that? And then, of course, the documentation of training. Have we documented enough so that when people walk away, so someone promotes out, someone retires, is the quality maintained? So we had to shift from documenting what we're doing to documenting how we're going to ensure that the lessons learned, the good things that we're doing, do not go away when Rebecca retires.
Right, right. And I think that comes back also to the framing. Oftentimes departments are focused on what do we need to do to get out of the consent decree rather
Yes.
than we're making changes for durable and sustainable reform, which is, I think, is an important message, not only for the court, but it's also for those folks. Becca, you mentioned about how all of a sudden people want to take away your resources because you're done with the consent decree or you've complied with this. And then, of course, the perceptions, because I recall for the LAPD, from the community and this fear that once there was no federal monitoring, it would slip back to the old days. So Becca, let me ask you, because I mentioned I'd come back to you about this issue of sustainability. How have you dealt with it? You have a more recent experience now in terms of the community response to the idea that the majority of the consent decree is completed and just focusing on a couple of areas.
Well, I think we do that by way of transparency and being very upfront with what our data are showing, what we're reading from our data, what our next steps are, how we're looking to not just maintain a, you know, a static level of compliance with the terms of the consent decree, but take it to the next level and include stakeholders in those discussions. And I do think too, you know, there becomes a sense of, well, we can't shift this up because we were required to do this under the consent decree. These are the protocols that were established. We can't shift from those. You know, if consent decrees are indeed intended to be create learning organizations, it's important to make sure that we're building on the reforms that have taken place to date. And I'll just give a brief example of that, and that's with early intervention systems. And you know, Arif and Sandy Jo, I think where we first met was with the crime lab, working towards a new model of an early intervention system. We had concerns about the early intervention system that was prescribed by the consent decree. We argued our point. We were unsuccessful at that point. Fast forward to 2016, we sat across the table from the Department of Justice. They looked at where we were intending to go with this, the science behind where we were looking to go. And they said completely open to revisiting how you look at early intervention. And that opened the door for us to really take it to the next level and use some advanced analytics to look at factors upstream of police behavior that suggest the importance of intervention. So I guess, you know, to succinctly answer the question, transparency and always leaning into, you know, with the stakeholders, this is where we're going, tell us why we're wrong.
No, and thank you for touching on the EIS. I think that's an important thing that maybe for future webinars, it's definitely something we could drill into more because it's often required, but also has some both challenges and benefits to it. So with the few minutes we have left, and it's only about 5 minutes left, I'd like to have each of you just conclude by helping those who are listening who aren't in consent decrees, are never going to, will never likely be in a consent decree for whatever reason, but are looking for what have you learned that can help those agencies become better, be better organizations, whether it's a learning or operationally, et cetera. And let me start off with you, Sandy Jo. What through your experiences in the LAPD experience can help other departments who just want to get better and want to improve in serving the community?
So one of the things I always say, don't rest on your laurels. Don't, you know, if you have the state of the art, whatever, don't think it's state of the art tomorrow. So that would be my first thought. Second, agencies, especially today, are so thin. And so they're going from, you know, basically administratively call to call to call. What I say is just know at some point something's going to blow. And when it does, see that challenge as an opportunity, because that is when they say, okay, let's dig deep and figure out what's going on. If you have the opportunity, I always say, look at what's going on, look at your practices. All of those things are really, really important. We're heading into summer, it's tough, and there's always something that goes sideways at some point. And so many times people look at that as, oh my gosh, this is terrible. What are we going to do? And from learning from one of my bosses, Bill Bratton, he always saw those challenges as opportunities. And that's sometimes when you can get the political arena that you're dealing with to listen what you need. Maybe you haven't been able to get something technology driven, as what Rebecca's talking about, you know, analytics and things like that. And the last thing I'll say is, please know that the BJA has so much that they can offer. The Knowledge Lab has so much they can offer. Don't wait till you have that crisis. Start looking at what's out there now. So then I'll kick it to whoever's next.
Okay. Well, I'll go to Becca. Let me just add on that, just to reiterate. You don't have to call the LAPD to find out what to do with a consent decree. There are a lot of lessons learned, and always asking, wanting to know why do you do it this way, because then there may be various reasons. But Becca, let me turn to you. What advice would you give the agencies about lessons learned?
If I could go back and do one thing over, it would be to really focus on change management with the officers. I think Chicago led up a training for all personnel on this is what the consent decree is, this is what it requires. Demystify it for your officers, and let them be part of the change, and don't let it land as an indictment of the hard work that they're doing in the field. They're just putting into practice the training and the policies that you as a department create. They have the expertise of dealing with people on the streets every day, and they can be incredible change agents if they're brought in early.
Great. Thank you, Becca. And Brian, you've got the last word with the last couple of minutes we have.
Yeah, I cannot emphasize what Becca just said enough, that taking care of your people during this process, bringing them along for the journey rather than doing it to them, is absolutely critical. But in terms of what did we learn, I'll echoing everything that was said, I'll turn to transparency. I think the major lesson is show your work. Let your community know how you are going to handle a crisis, what's going to happen. If you have, for example, officer-involved shooting protocols, put them out. Let your media and your community know how this works so that you're not trying to explain it amidst the crisis, and then follow what you promised. And if you do that, you already have some trust and legitimacy, and that is probably our most precious resource right now in policing. Police departments historically have been loath to show their work or open their doors, and believing that they are the experts, or that no one understands policing other than police. I think it is incumbent upon us to help people understand what policing is, why it's so difficult and complicated, and acknowledge that we will make mistakes, and it's not just the making of the mistake, it's how you respond to it that is critically important.
Great. Well, thank you, Brian, for those closing comments. Those were excellent, as well as all of your comments, and especially your insights, Sandy, Joe, Becca, Brian. It's always I always learn something from talking to all of you, and I think what you've been able to share will hopefully be helpful to all the participants and all the agencies out there who are trying to do their best to help protect communities, pursue justice. I want to thank everybody for joining us today in our first webinar. We hope to see you again in the future. If you have thoughts and ideas that you think would be useful, please send them to the National Policing Institute, who is hosting these. And also this video of this panel discussion will be posted on the National Law Enforcement Knowledge Lab website if you have friends, colleagues, or others who might be interested in hearing the great insights from our panelists. Thanks very much, everybody. Be safe and have a wonderful weekend.